Good afternoon, everyone. It'd be nice if some of you can put on your cameras. Appreciate that quite a lot of you might be eating or something at the same time, so that's fine. But if some of you can put on the cameras, it's nice, I think, for the presenters to see that there's actually some humans there. It's not just a computer click the button. My name is Steve Davies. I'm past president of the PPMA, and currently I'm the treasurer and secretary for the PPMA. In my professional role, I work for London councils supporting the London Borough Heads of HR. So today's seminar, it's our second of the year. Really great to welcome colleagues from GatenbySanderson and Leah Catlal, who in particular is going to be taking us through this session today. The webinar is on redefining leadership in public sector. They've done some research and they've got lots of insight in terms of their the way in which they've been working with clients over the years in terms of how their thought process in terms of how we might need to redefine leadership in public sector going forward. So I won't spend any more time. Leah Cat will take you through. We'll hopefully have a little bit of time at the end for questions. Please put questions into the chat, and we can pick them up from there. And it's scheduled to finish at 12:30. So over to you, Leah Cat.
Thank you, Steve, and good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, to be invited to talk to you about redefining leadership in the public sector. As Steve said, my name is Leah Catlal. I'm a partner within the leadership and talent practice within GatenbySanderson. You will probably know us more for our executive recruitment part of our business, and some of my colleagues have joined today as well. And you will know that we have been delivering executive search services and consultancy across the UK for over the last 20 years. From those relationships that we've created by placing very senior leaders across all of the public sectors within the UK, we've developed relationships where we've come back in and we've carried out leadership development, executive team development, coaching, and that's really evolved into our leadership and talent practice. And I head up our leadership and OD part of that practice. So delighted to be here. I was just joking with Steve. I've just heard that Jurgen Klopp has announced his resignation from Liverpool Football Club for the end of the season. And as we're talking about redefining leadership, if there's ever a great example of emotionally intelligent, compassionate leadership that came into an organization until it redefined it and gave it success, I think Jurgen Klopp's a great example of that. So I want to start this webinar by, first of all, sharing with you some insight done by a comprehensive leadership survey or research. And I remember I was talking at the MJ event a couple of years ago, and I finished off with this, and I want to start this session with this. And this is the work done by Rosalind Torres, who spent years looking at what does it take to be a great leader. And she researched right across the world, both public and private sector organizations. And she concluded that there are three questions which define or should define leadership in the 21st century. And those three questions were, where are you looking to anticipate change? So this is all about how close are you to understanding the complexities of change. So what are the sources of knowledge that as leaders we are using to make connections and assumptions about what's going to happen in the future? The second question that she left us with was, what is the diversity of your network? So how different are the people around you with whom you are having meaningful conversations with? Because this feeds into our diversity of thought, and it feeds into how challenging is our environment in terms of the leadership decisions that we are making. And then the final question that she left us with was, are you courageous enough to abandon the past? And this is all about, where are you operating in terms of your presence? You know, are you being pulled back to what's already happened, or are you being present enough and courageous enough to look ahead and let go of that? So I want to start off by talking a little bit about the context of leadership today. and how it's shifting and why it's needing that redefinition. And I want to share with you the whole context of change. So you'll see a graph here. On one side, you've got the speed of change, and on the other side, you've got time. That red line represents exponential change. Okay, so right now we are seeing unprecedented change being driven by three major forces. Those three forces are technological growth, climate change, and globalization. And all three, for the first time, are accelerating and are interrelated. And they are creating both exponential change, which means that it's getting faster, and inexorable change, which means that it can't be stopped. So it's a bit like the Terminator, although what we don't need Sarah Connor to do that. And it's estimated, sorry, along that curve, you've then got a linear line. And this represents human adaptability to change. Now, can you see a problem here? And you will see that the gap between exponential change and human adaptability is actually getting wider. Now, it's estimated that we are about here, above the inflection point. And I was just reading this morning about, I don't know whether you saw the story around the French farmers who are protesting against the French government, and they were being interviewed, and they were saying the change is too fast for us to cope with. And so that exponential change is having a real impact. What that means is that that space, that gap, this is the challenge for leadership today. It's about how do you lead people, processes, organizations through that widening chasm that we're seeing. It's estimated that 80% of organizations that exist today will not exist in the next 5 to 10 years. And the reason behind that is around the principle of disruption. It's far more impactful for the private sector. So those organizations that are existing today in the private sector are having to keep up with that red line. And we've seen the stories of Blockbuster and Woolworths about great traditional brands who've not been able to keep up because they've been disrupted by cheaper, quicker, better functionality. There's a whole range of drivers that drive that exponential change. The private sector is interesting. The public sector is interesting because it is more aligned to that green line for very obvious reasons, in terms of resource, in terms of its governance and scrutinizing remit. There's a whole difference in terms of the expectations of leadership, both in the private sector and within the public sector. But this throws up the role of failure, which I think is really important when we start to differentiate what are the differences and why is it important. Now, I'm just going to show you the relationship between the speed of failure and the impact of failure. The impact, which is on the left-hand side there, you'll see, and you've got high and low. So when the impact of failure is high, the poo hits the fan. People lose careers and jobs and lives. It's severe. When the impact of failure is low, it can be tolerated. Along the bottom axis is the speed of failure, where you've got low, so you've got fast on one side and slow on the other. So it happens quickly, or it takes a long time for it to happen. Now, as you can see, I've created a 2x2 grid there, and just to talk through that. When failure has a high impact and it is slow, that's what creates crisis. This is what creates tomorrow's headline. And in the public sector, this is one of the greatest drivers of leadership. You want to avert this. Okay. And we've seen some great examples of this over the last 10, 20 years. I mean, just recently, if you look at the Horizons Post Office event, if you look at High Speed 2, pulling the plug and all that, are really good examples of that. But also, if you look back at the last 10, 20 years, the NHS IT system, which took up £10 billion of public sector of taxpayer money, took 10 years for then the conclusion to be that it's actually ineffective. If any of you have ever been to Edinburgh and spoken to the local people about the tram service, you will know that it took nearly a decade to make. It cost nearly 3 times its original budget, and took twice as long to make, and they only made half of what was planned. So some real examples of where the impact is high and we let it continue and it's prevalent. I mentioned the difference between the private sector and the private sector is far more unforgiving. If you're not creating revenue and if you're not satisfying your customers, the failure can be fast and the impact is high, but you won't survive. But I want to draw your attention to that bottom left-hand grid, which is around the impact of failure is low and the speed is fast. And this is where learning happens, and this is where innovation happens. You know, it's about being able to test, to probe, to experiment, and to learn from that. The challenge for the public sector now is how, as leaders, do we avert tomorrow's headline? So we avert that crisis, but at the same time, we're expected to learn. We're expected to do more for less. We're expected to innovate. We're expected to juggle competing priorities to ensure that. And for me, that's the real challenge around, you know, where public sector leadership is trying to straddle both managing that crisis and that risk aversion, but at the same time being able to innovate and being able to learn and fail low and fail fast. So I want to share with you, and I think at the crux of this also is around decision-making and critical decision-making in leadership. And I want to share with you the work. Well, first of all, I want to share with you some of the insights that we've seen from leadership. And then I want to share with you a framework that was proposed by a guy called Dave Snowden. So as I mentioned earlier, GS, we recruit, we place thousands of leaders across the public sector. As part of that, what we've done is we've profiled our leaders and candidates right across the board, and it's provided us with input from thousands of data points, which has created a model that we called our altitude leadership model, which comprises of 3 areas of focus. And within those 3 areas of focus, we've identified 4 specific clusters of competencies and behaviors that we feel are relevant to leadership today. The first cluster is the focus on self. So this is around individual leadership. So our ability to engage and inspire. It's about the impact we have on others based on our own leadership. The second area is around the focus on people. So as leaders, how do we turn up for others and how do we engage and collaborate with others? So it's about relationships, it's about our influence, but also around how do we collaborate and create that team unity. And then the third area is around our focus on the organization, on the outcomes. And this is around the understanding the commercials, the financials, but also around strategy, around innovation and transformation, and also around diversity and inclusion. Now, I want to share with you now just the snapshot of, and this data, by the way, is ever evolving, and we have the ability to be able to really fish out and identify specific sectors based on this. But I want to show you all of the public sector in the UK today, which looks like this. So I've split this into the 3 areas, and what you can see at the bottom are the 12 characteristics. And just as a snapshot of the effectiveness of public sector leaders, right? So you can see both self and people, generally there are strengths. The real area where we're not seeing as effectiveness is that area around outcomes. And just looking at those 12 areas just specifically, under self, the area that there isn't effectiveness is engage and inspire, which is under self. For people, it's around influence and impact. And then under outcomes, the 2 areas that, again, we're not seeing the effectiveness in public sector leaders is that commerciality, that social art, commercial head, and that innovation piece as well, which kind of reinforces some of the input that I've already shared with you in terms of that innovation, that learning fast and learning quickly, but also that governance and that statutory requirement that leading in the public sector also brings with it. Right, I want to move on to share with you the framework, the Cynefin framework, based on the work that David Snowden's done. the exponential change is creating what we call a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world. And it's really shifting the need of leadership to operate from domains of predictability. So you can see that on the left-hand side, to domains of unpredictability. And under the spectrum sit 4 domains. So 2 on the side of predictability and 2 on the side of unpredictability. On the side of predictability, you've firstly got the domain of clarity. So this is about what we know, our known knowns. And when we are leading and making decisions based on this domain, it's all about the playbook. It's about regulation. We follow the rules, we follow the regulations. This stuff is already created for us. And in a sense, it's easy to follow because we fall back onto that. The second domain on the side of predictability is that of complication. And this is about our known unknowns. So we know what we don't know. And when we make decisions under the domains of complication, we bring in the expertise. So as leaders, we are not expected to know everything, but as leaders, we ensure that that expertise and that understanding is brought in within that. Leading on this side of predictability is all about what we know and what we can bring in. But it has got much more interesting when we start to look at unpredictability. So the third domain is one around complexity, our unknown unknowns. And complexity is interesting because it creates a phenomena called emergence. And when that happens, we observe it, we see it, and we can work out the root cause, and then it makes sense. But we can't predict it. So the complexity is all about the creation of emergence. You know, when they were making cars in the 30s and 40s and at the Ford plant, no one talked about traffic jams because that wasn't a concept that we even comprehended. And that is an emergence of complexity. And we're seeing emergence come all over the place in terms of how we're having to manage complexity. And then the final one is chaos. This is about unknowables. And the difference between chaos and complexity is that with complexity, with complication, with clarity, there is a frame or a term of reference for knowledge. With chaos, there isn't. Okay, so when we are faced with examples of chaos, you know, it's about acting first within that. The trap is that in the public sector and in the private sector is about how aware are we and present are we of the domains from which we operate, because that is relative to the kind of decision that we need to make. And I want to share a story with you that happened 2,000 years ago in Eastern China. For those of you who are familiar with Chinese history, geographical history, will know that the Yellow River runs from the west to the east across China. And the river has contributed for centuries to the economic growth, regeneration, and development of livelihood of all the settlements that live along the banks of the river. When it floods, it destroys those. When it doesn't, it provides incredibly fertile environment for that development to happen. So the river and the flow of the river has been incredibly important to the Chinese, but it would flood. And so it was a problem. And at that time, the emperor 2,000 years ago gave a guy called Gun the challenge of doing something about the problem of the river. What Gun did was he built a dam. He tried to control the river, right? The river was a complex problem. What Gun tried to do was use tools of the domains of predictability, and the river could not be controlled. The banks would burst, and it would overflow again. He spent his whole life trying to solve this problem, and then he gave the challenge to his son, who was called Wu the Great. So what a literally great name. What Wu did was he went and lived with the villagers along the banks for years to understand what the river meant, what the flow of the river meant. He brought in experts and agricultural meisters of the time. He studied irrigation systems and canal systems. What he did was He worked with the river. He created a series of dikes, canals, irrigation systems, and allowed to work with the complexity of the river. And so it's a really good example of when we are trying to lead and manage, it's about, do you understand the complexity, or do you understand the domains in which you're operating from? What Who the Great did was, he got close to the complexity. He probed, he experimented, and he went with the problem rather than trying to control it. And this is a common trap that we are seeing within public sector leadership. It's about the capability and capacity of being able to deal with unpredictability, but falling into the traps of using tools of predictability, which leads to poor decision making. And it leads to falling into what you know more. And I'm not going to go into this, but we saw during the whole COVID experience of where, both from a central and a local leadership point of view, where we were in each one of these domains. And there are examples of where effective decisions weren't made based on the fact that we were making decisions from domains that we weren't actually in. This framework acts as a step. Okay, the highest step is the domain of clarity. The step below it is the domain of complication. The step below that is the domain of complexity, and the bottom step is chaos. Which is why, if we fall from the domain of clarity to the domain of chaos, that is the most steepest fall, and it's the one that creates the greatest disorientation and confusion. And so from chaos, we need to understand what the problem is, so we need to act. We move to complexity. At complexity, we need to get close to the problem before we can bring in the expertise to really comprehend. So we move to complication. At complication, we want to make sure that we understand that for future, so it becomes actual clarity with that. And I think when we are redefining leadership, it's really beginning to understand how present are we and how agile are we when we are thinking about what needs to happen within that. Now, I'm just going to stop sharing, actually, because I just want to conclude, and I know that we've nearly come to the end of that. There's a few things I just want to say. We've been talking about, and I've been talking about the importance of understanding the context, the domains which we operate in, to understand the impact of failure, to understand how change is affecting the way we actually lead. But before we even redefine leadership, it's important to define it in the first place. And the work that we do, we work right across the public sector. And so many times I've gone into organizations and I've said, how do you define leadership around here? And people say, we don't, we haven't, we just get on with doing the stuff that we need to do. And so my challenge is that if you haven't defined it, how are you expecting people to deliver it, to deploy it? Right? For us, leadership is very much, it's very simply, and I know it's not simple, but it's very simply creating belief in people. And in order for us to create belief in people, we have to have something to say and the courage to say it. Because otherwise, we're just managers. We are administrators of risk aversion. And why is it that a neurodiverse teenager from Sweden can galvanize a global movement around climate change? She has no authority, she has no position. Yet within examples within our own country, we see elected representatives who come from extreme privilege, who've spent all their lives having resources put into them, plowed into them to develop their capability as leaders, yet they evoke no trust within us. Because leadership is about creating belief in it. And when we talk about that, it's about, and a lot of the public sector leaders that we work with, I say to them, what is your purpose here? What is it? Because that's the narrative that will get you the belief, and we totally understand that it's important for you to manage that risk and make it worse. What is it that's connecting you with people around you? That's the first point. The second point is around how we, it's that courage. How present are we in terms of what is going on for you? And just going back to the point that I made there about, the actual framework, about being present, about the domains that you operate in. And the third thing that I want to leave you with is around the relationship we have in the public sector between executive and political leadership, because I think there are examples of that where it works well, it's congruent, it's authentic, and we see the benefit of it. Where it doesn't work well, it's toxic and it's dispiriting, and it actually is not about, it's not about leadership. And just to finish off, it was the Persian philosopher Rumi who once said, "I was clever and I wanted to change the world. Now I am wise and I want to change myself." Thank you for listening. I think we've got a few minutes, Steve, for some questions. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you. It's yeah, really good, great sort of thought process there. Um, just, just one thing from me, a comment more than anything. You did the speed of change and the change curve, and the fact that actually there's the ability to adapt and that, and it struck me that actually the on your unpredictability spectrum, the fact that the decision making has probably been pushed more into the chaotic style because of the speed of change, as opposed to having time to sort of sort out the complexities of the issues and understand and create something that can resolve that. Anyway, that was just a thought.
Thank you, Steve.
Frank O'Sullivan has put a couple of points in the chat. There, I suppose they're points for discussion, debate. But, so the first point you can raise, you read for yourself, is about the great leaders and behaviours, and should we just focus more on sort of general commonalities. I suppose actually more, if I'm reading it correctly, it's more about team dynamics as opposed to individuals. And then the other point he's saying about the structures, the way in which local government works in particular, or government works, is very much driven by rules and regulations, and therefore is our businesses sort of set up more for a world of known knowns, as opposed to the other domains that you painted. So I don't know if you've got any points, any comments on those.
I do, and thank you, Frank. Just to go back to the first point, leadership isn't easy. It's really complex, and it's getting even more complex. You know, there's a if you go onto Amazon or you Google, and there's a whole industry. You know, 95% of it, I would say, you know, I would challenge its validity in terms of, you know, how accurate it is. And for me, it's different people and situations will want different things at different times for different events. That's extremely complex. And as leaders, we're expected to respond to that in a way that it's integral, in a way that's actually effective. So I totally get the point that you're making there, Frank. The second point actually is really interesting because the known knowns, and I get that, but there's a real shift to the unknowns and to complexity as well, you know, which is why it's safe and we're familiar with managing risk because we're trying to avert the headline for tomorrow. But at the same time, the competing demands that you're seeing, and a local government is a really good example. I mean, the last year, if you just look at the Section 104, and if you look at some of the media coverage that's come with that, you know, that's a complex challenge for leadership, because not only are you trying to manage the books, you're also trying to connect with human beings on a personal, social, and emotional level as well. So I think it throws up, you know, so much in terms of what that leadership capability needs to be.
Yeah, thank you. Great. Well, I don't see any other comments. I think, to be honest, so you've packed in so much there and such great insight. I'm not sure whether there's any more questions. It'd be general sort of points like Frank has put. There's none in the chat though. So again, just want to thank you for your contribution. Fantastic. I'm certainly going to suggest that some people in my organisations look at the recording of this, because you've given some great insights there. Thank you, Leah.
You're welcome, Steve. And we you know, we'll be more than happy. Sorry, I need to give a quick plug. We'll be more than happy to follow up conversations with people around leadership development within your organisation.
Yeah, definitely, of course. And yeah, certainly from my perspective, happy to try and arrange a discussion or a talk with some of the people in our London Borough's HR networks. It's a future meeting. So, okay, thank you very much, everybody. Really good session, and thank you. And we'll see you at some point in the near future. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. See you later, Steve.